Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about solving quadratic equations by factoring, which we've done in the past, but we're going to start off by writing a quadratic equation in standard form with the given roots. So this is actually very similar to something we have done in the past in the last unit. Alright, so in a sense, it could be easier. So remember, if I get the roots of 3, negative 4, then that means, if you remember this formula that we had, right, that we had an x minus root 1, x minus root 2. So in essence, it's going to be a little bit easier because on this one, they're not asking you for the vertical stretch. Okay, so all they want to know is if I plug in this roots back into this formula, remember this would be a negative 3, right? And this would be a negative of a negative 4, which essentially is going to make that a positive 4. Okay, so that's what I have. And then now in this one, we don't have to find the vertical stretch. However, they want us to write this in standard form. And standard form means that you're going to have to FOIL this to get the answer. So if you remember, you're going to multiply this times this, that times that, this times this, and this last term times the last term. Okay, so we have x squared plus 4x minus 3x minus 12. Alright, so the answer for this one would be x squared if you add the like terms, which are, it's going to be positive 1x or just negative x, would be this. Okay? So again, this is the quadratic equation in standard form. And again, if you wanted to check to see if this is right, if you get a factor, you can just set this equal to 0 and solve for it. Alright. Moving on to, I'm going to do another one like this, just to kind of, if you don't understand the first time, we're going to do it one more time. So number 3, again on this one we have two roots, 1 and negative 9, 1 and 9, so that means that we have 1, x minus 1, x minus 9, and they want to know what the equation would be. So on this, you just have to FOIL again, so we have x times x, which is x squared, x times negative 9, which is negative 9x, negative 1 times x is negative x, and negative 1 times negative 9 is positive 9. So the answer will be, after you add the like terms, x squared minus 10x plus 9. Okay. That is it for that. And then let's do number 4. So number 4, they actually only give you one root. So what that means, if they give you one root, is that means that you have a double root. So when you have a double root, you're actually just going to write that same root twice. So remember, if I have a negative 5, that would mean that I would have a minus a negative 5 like that. And I have an x minus a negative 5. So again, this is a double root, which means you would have x plus 5, x plus 5. Okay, and if you FOIL that, you would get x squared plus 10x plus 25. And then on this one, they actually, on your book, they actually write it as equal to 0, meaning if you were to solve for that, you would get the roots. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to, let's see which one would be harder than that. Let's go ahead and move on to like number 7. Okay, so number 7, you have a fraction, so that kind of makes it a little bit strange, but it turns out to be not too bad. So again, remember that this is a negative, which is going to be a positive 1/3 and an x minus 5. Okay, and you may think this might be complicated, but all you really have to do, alright, there's a trick for a question like this. All you have to do is bring this 3 up over here. Alright, that will give you 3x plus 1, x minus 5. Now you might be thinking, I don't know why that works, but if you really think about it, okay, I'm going to make a little side note here, with a little sticky note. If you don't know why that is, how come I can just move that 3 over there? Remember that if I were, let me actually give you the whole answer here. So I'm going to FOIL here. So I have 3x squared minus 15x plus x minus 5. If I add like terms, I get x squared minus 14x minus 5. Okay, so now I'm going to show you why that actually works. Okay, so this actually works because, remember, if I were to factor, right, so if I'm factoring, I'm actually going backwards. If I were to factor, I would end up with those two factors, and if I set each factor equal to 0, like I'm doing here, well, this one's easy. This one's just x is equal to 5 if I add a 5 to both sides. By this one, if I subtract a 1 and then divide by 3, I would get a negative 1/3, which is the root, okay? So again, one more time, if you have a fraction, all you have to do is bring the bottom of the fraction up to the top of it, right beside that x. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more over here. So we'll do number 9. So number 9, same thing. We're going to have x plus 7, x minus 3/4. And remember what I said, if you have a fraction, you're going to just bring the bottom of this fraction, you're going to bring that up and put that right beside the 4x, okay? So one more time, just bring this 4 in front of this x. So we have x plus 7, 4x minus 3 is equal to 0, and then you're going to go ahead and FOIL that. So we have 4x squared. Let's say that would give me a negative 3x. 7 times 4x would be positive 28x. And then 7 times negative 3 is negative 21. Okay, if I add like terms, I end up with 4x squared plus 25x minus 21. That's equal to 0. So that's the answer for that right there. Okay. Now let me go ahead and move on to the back here. Now the back of these notes, okay, is actually the same thing that we've been working on for quite a while now. So this is actually nothing new. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at it. So in this one, we're actually solving by factoring, which we have already done in the past. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But if you're looking at this, remember that the first thing you always look for is the greatest common factor. So in this one, the greatest common factor will be 2x. Okay? Now if I divide this 6x squared by 2x, I get a 3x. And if I divide this negative 2x by 2x, I get a negative 1. Okay? Now make sure that whatever is inside the parentheses cannot be factored again. And in this case, you cannot factor that again. So after that, all you have to do is just set each factor equal to 0. And then solve for each factor. In this case, if I divide both sides by 2, x is still going to be equal to 0. And on the other side, similarly to what we did on the back, alright, if I add 1 to each side and then divide by 3, I get x is equal to 1 over 3. Okay, so this is one answer, this is one root, and this is another answer. Okay. Alright, so let's do one just like that. So let me go on to number 2. So on this one right here, before I start factoring, remember that we talked this in the past. Before I start to factor, I have to set this quadratic equation equal to 0, meaning I want to subtract or add everything to one side, where I have the quadratic equation on one side and a 0 on the other side of the equal sign. And also it's important to note that I want my x squared to be positive. Okay, so I'm not going to subtract x squared over here. I mean, I can, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's going to take a little bit longer. I want my x squared term, or my square term, to be positive. So anyways, in this case, our common factor between those two is going to be x. Remember, x squared is the same thing as x times x, and this one's just x. So what do they have in common? If this one can be written as x times x, all right. Well, what we have in common is this, right? Now you don't have to write it like that. I'm just writing this for the people that still don't understand this. Okay. So I'm going to factor out an x. And I would be left off with x minus 7 is equal to 0. And if I set each factor equal to 0, then one of my answers will be x is equal to 0, the other one will be x is equal to positive 7. Okay. Alright. Now on number 3, I'm not going to do it, but if you do it on your own, if you want to check that, if you want to check your understanding, you would get an answer that's 0, another one that's negative 5 over 4. Alright, so I recommend you try it, see if you can get it. Alright, now let's go ahead and move on to a question like number 7. Right, number 7. Alright, first step when you're solving by factor, remember this has to be equal to 0. And if it's not, you must subtract or add. Now this one's already equal to 0, so that's not a big deal. So the next step is to factor. Now remember, if there's not a number in front of the x squared, then this is basically a 1. And if this is a 1, we're just going to do the very simple trinomial factoring. And all you have to do is have x and x. Now remember, you have a negative 30. Negative 30 means you're going to have, you have multiply a positive and a negative number. And remember that the biggest factor is going to be positive because the middle term is positive. So again, you multiply two numbers to make it into a negative 30. So one's positive, one negative. But they have to add up to be a positive 1. So my biggest factor, whenever I do find it, is going to be positive. So factors of 30 that add up to positive 1. Let's see. If you didn't know, 1 and 30, 2 and 15. 3 and 10, 4 not a factor, 5 and 6. Okay, so look at all these factors that I have written. Which one, if you subtract one from the other, do you get a difference of 1? In this case, it will be 6 and 5. My biggest factor is 6. So write that here, write the 5 here. Okay? So, excuse me, that was a bell for a request. So that's equal to 0. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. If I subtract 6 from each side, I get x is equal to negative 6. If I if I add 5 to each side, I get x is equal to 5. Okay. Okay, so let's do one similar to that, except for now I'm not going to take nearly as long, like number 9. On number 9, if I factor this, notice that it's already equal to 0. I have no common factors. And also, the number in front of the x squared is just a 1. So this is just simple trinomial factoring. X and x. I have a positive 33, which means I have the same sign. And because 14 is positive, that means I have the same sign, and both of them are going to be positive. Okay? So I need factors of 33 that add up to 14. Now in this case, this is going to be 11 and 3. Okay, set each factor equal to 0. So you may already know this by now, hopefully. Hopefully by now this is just review for you. Subtract 3 from each side, you get negative 3. Okay. Now on the last couple, alright, on number 10 and 11, we're going to go ahead and do, again, set them equal to 0. Okay, set this equal to 0 already is. There is no common factor, and the number in front of the x squared is a 4. All right, now this is the type of factoring that where you would normally do the the little x here, and then we multiply the 4 and the 7, and that's 28. And then we put the 27 here, and we think of factors of 28 that up to 27. Since this is negative, one's positive, one's negative. So this would be 28 and negative 1. Okay. And then, so I'm going to do it like we normally do it. Then I would write it as 4x squared plus 28x minus x. And if you're writing this, you might want to hold on, okay? Don't write this until I'm done. So then we have a minus 7 here equal to 0. Common factor between those two. The common factor between those two is 4x. This is x plus 7. Common factor between those two. If this one's negative, you're going to factor out a negative 1. So we're going to factor out a negative 1, so this is x plus 7. You're going to bring those two together, so we have 4x minus 1. And you got x plus 7 is equal to 0. Okay, so that's how you factor that. Now we're going to teach you a slightly different way, and this is what we used to teach last year and the year before that. So this is the method we call bottoms up, which is essentially the same, it's just a slightly different. All right, so we're going to multiply that and that. So again, I'm teaching you a slightly different method. So we have x squared plus 27x minus 28 is equal to 0. So notice that now I'm going to factor this. All right, so I'm going to try to factor this. So just like that one, factors to 28. Since this is negative, that means that this is going to be positive, this is going to be negative. Factors 28, they add up to 27. One's positive, one's negative, so they're actually going to subtract to be 27. 28 and 1. Okay? Now, the next step, normally on what this method we usually call bottoms up, is that we're going to divide each one of these by the leading coefficient. This one. Alright, so we're going to divide this by 4 and this by 4. Now, if you can, and this is a part, the reason we are trying not to teach this anymore is because a lot of students miss this part. You need to either divide this or reduce. So you always need to reduce both fractions or divide if you can, if you're going to get a whole number. In this case, I get a 7. And in this case, I cannot reduce any more than it already is. Alright, now if I divide this is going to give me a decimal point. So if you encounter something like this, then the reason it's called bottoms up is because you're going to bring the bottom of this fraction up, kind of similar to what I did on the front. So this would be 4x minus 1 is equal to 0. And then now I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve. This is x is equal to negative 7. And if I add 1, and then divided by 4, I get x is equal to 1/4. Okay. So that's how you do it. Alright, so I'm going to do one more using bottoms up strictly. So I'm going to do 11. Excuse me. So number 11. Alright, make sure you don't have a common, this is already equal to 0. We don't have a common factor, so always make sure to do that first. And since we don't have a common factor and the leading coefficient, this number is bigger than 1, now I'm going to do the extreme factoring, the one that we already taught you, or we're going to do bottoms up. Now I'm going to do bottoms up just to kind of remind you how to do it. If you kind of like this method better, use this one. Alright, so 3 times negative 10. We have x squared plus 29x minus 30 is equal to 0. Alright, now I'm going to factor this right here. Alright, strictly this, I'm not worried about that. So I have x, let's see, 1's plus, 1 minus. Those are interesting factors, but nonetheless, I'm looking for factors of 30. One's positive, one's negative, so they're going to subtract. They add up to be 29. In this case, that's going to be 30 and 1. Alright? Now, after I have found my factors, remember, I'm going to divide both of these by my leading coefficient, which is 3. Okay? Now, if you can divide evenly, then do it. In this case, I can on this side. And on this side, after you have reduced the fraction, then bring this up to the front. So this is 3x minus 1. Alright, now that I've successfully factored this, make sure to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So this is x is equal to negative 10. And on this one, if I add the 1 and divide by 3, I get x is equal to 1/3. Okay? If you want to try bottoms up with number 12, you can. And when you do, you get two answers. One is a negative 1/2, and the other one's going to be a positive 4/3.